Take her out. The words didn't echo, they landed flat, final, like a decision already made long before she stepped into the room. And Ava Johnson felt the grip tighten around her arm as the security officer guided her toward the glass doors, his hand firm but not rough, practiced, as if he'd done this 100 times before and expected no resistance this time either. Her shoes slipping slightly against the polished marble floor that reflected the overhead lights in cold, perfect lines, the kind of floor that showed everything except the people who cleaned it. And for a moment the entire boardroom seemed to hold its breath without meaning to, not out of concern but out of quiet agreement. Because this was how things worked here. This was order. This was hierarchy. This was a place where someone like her did not belong in the middle of a meeting worth more than most people's lifetimes. And yet her eyes didn't lower, didn't dart, didn't search for permission. They stayed fixed on the long table behind her where the contract still lay open, one page slightly lifted by the air conditioning vent above, fluttering just enough to catch her attention the same way it had minutes earlier when she was wiping fingerprints off the glass partition, when she wasn't supposed to read anything, wasn't supposed to notice anything, wasn't supposed to exist beyond the quiet rhythm of cloth against surface, but she had noticed. And now as the door in front of her began to swing inward with a soft hydraulic hiss, she spoke, not loudly, not urgently, just clearly enough to cut through the polished silence. You're about to lose everything, page 17. And the timing of it was strange, almost misplaced, like a line delivered too late in a script no one expected her to be part of. And a few heads turned not because they believed her, but because they were surprised she said anything at all. One executive letting out a short breath that could have been a laugh, another shaking his head, as if dismissing. A child who wandered into the wrong room. The security officer pausing just half a second, as if unsure whether to keep moving or wait for instruction that wasn't coming, and behind them all, at the far end of the table, Richard Whitmore didn't look up right away, his pen hovering above the final page, silver against white, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, as though the interruption hadn't reached him yet or didn't deserve to. And Ava felt the cool air brush against her face as the gap of the doorway widened, the hallway beyond dimmer, quieter, safer in a way that meant disappearing again, returning to a place where no one questioned her presence because no one noticed it in the first place. But something in her didn't step forward, didn't follow the pull of the hand at her arm. Instead, she held just enough resistance to stay where she was, not fighting, not refusing, just not leaving. And when she spoke again, her voice didn't rise, didn't tremble. It settled, anchored, as if the words had weight she didn't need to prove. Subsection C. And this time it didn't land as lightly, not because of volume, but because of precision, because somewhere in the room, between the glass and steel and quiet confidence of people who believe they controlled outcomes, a thread had been pulled, invisible but real, and the air shifted just enough that even those who dismissed her felt it without understanding why. And still no one told the security officer to stop, and still Richard Whitmore hadn't moved, but the pen above the paper did not touch down, and in that suspended second, with the door half open and the world on either side waiting for a decision, the room was no longer as certain as it had been a moment ago. The hand on her arm loosened, not released, just uncertain, as if the man holding her had suddenly realized he might be part of something he did not fully understand. And Ava Johnson felt the shift before she saw it, the subtle change in pressure, the hesitation that did not belong in a place designed for certainty. And behind her the room no longer moved in smooth, predictable patterns. Chairs did not creak. Papers did not shuffle. Even the quiet hum of the air system seemed to fade into the background as attention, reluctant but undeniable, began to turn back toward the table she had just been pulled away from. And Ava did not step forward into the hallway, did not look back at the exit. Her gaze stayed steady, not on the executives, not on the security officer, but on the document itself, as if everything else in the room was secondary to the lines printed in black ink across that single page. Because to her it was not just a contract, it was a structure, a pattern, something that either held or collapsed depending on the smallest overlooked detail. And she had seen it before, not here, not in this building, but years ago at a kitchen table barely wide enough to hold a stack of borrowed textbooks, where numbers and clauses and case studies became her escape from the noise of a world that expected nothing from her except silence. And the memory flickered across her mind not as nostalgia, but as instinct. The same instinct that made her stop when she saw the page earlier. The same instinct that now kept her from walking away. And one of the executives leaned back in his chair with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest as if amused by the disruption. As if this was nothing more than an inconvenience that would be corrected in seconds. She read something online and thinks she understands it. He said quietly, not loud enough to challenge, just enough to dismiss. And a few others nodded, not because they agreed but because agreement was easier than questioning. And still the chairman had not spoken, but his hand had moved, almost imperceptibly, the pen lowering just enough to rest against the paper without making a mark, and Ava noticed that too. The way his attention shifted without announcing itself, the way his eyes, though still angled downward, were no longer scanning forward but returning, retracing, searching, and the page number lingered in the air like something unfinished, page 17, subsection C. And the security officer finally withdrew his hand completely, not instructed to do so, but no longer certain he should. Continue, stepping half a pace back as if to remove himself from the center of a moment that was no longer his to control, and Ava stood alone now, not escorted, not invited, just present, her uniform playing. Against the polished backdrop, her hands still at her sides, fingers relaxed, not clenched, not shaking, just still. And for a brief second she became aware of the distance between where she stood and where they sat, nearly 20 feet across a room designed to separate power from everything else. And yet the distance felt thinner now, less absolute, as if the line that defined who belonged and who did not had shifted without anyone agreeing to move it. And then, finally, Richard Whitmore's pen lifted off the page again, not to sign, not to dismiss, but to pause, suspended in a space where decisions were usually made quickly, and his other hand turned the corner of the document back by a fraction of an inch, just enough to see what he had already passed, just enough to confirm whether the interruption behind him had been noise or something else entirely. And Ava did not speak again, did not repeat herself, because she understood something the room did not, that once the right question entered a man's mind, especially a man used to control, it did not leave easily, and the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was searching, and in that searching, the balance of the room began, quietly, to change. Richard Whitmore did not rush, and that alone unsettled the room more than any raised voice could have, because men like him were known for decisiveness, for signatures that moved millions of dollars in seconds, for instincts that others trusted without question. Yet now his pace had slowed to something deliberate, almost cautious, his eyes narrowing slightly as they traced the lines he had already approved minutes earlier, and the faint crease forming between his brows did not go unnoticed by those seated closest to him, executives who had built entire careers on reading subtle shifts in power, on anticipating approval or rejection before it was spoken, and now they leaned forward just enough to see what he was seeing, though none dared to interrupt the silence that had settled over the table like a thin layer of ice, fragile but unbroken, and Ava remained where she was, not moving, not stepping closer. Her presence still out of place, yet no longer dismissed. Her reflection faintly visible in the glass panel beside the door, a quiet figure framed against a room that had been designed to exclude her, and still she did not look at them, only at the document, as if the truth she had pointed to did not belong to her, but to the paper itself, waiting to be acknowledged. And one of the senior partners cleared his throat softly, an attempt to reclaim momentum. "Mr. Whitmore, we are already behind schedule," he said, his tone measured, respectful, but carrying an edge of impatience that suggested this pause was unnecessary, that whatever had been said by someone like her could not possibly outweigh the due diligence of an entire legal team, and a few heads nodded again, more firmly this time, seeking reassurance and collective confidence. But Richard did not respond immediately, his finger now resting lightly on a single line of text, tapping once, then stilling, as if confirming its existence before allowing its meaning to fully surface. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not raised, not sharp, just precise. "Read this," he said, turning the document slightly toward the partner beside him. and the shift in posture around the table was immediate, subtle but unmistakable, as attention narrowed to that single page, that single subsection that moments ago had meant nothing and now carried weight, and the partner adjusted his glasses, leaning in, his eyes scanning quickly at first, then slowing, then stopping altogether as the realization settled in stages rather than all at once, like a structure revealing a flaw only when viewed from the right angle. And his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, the confidence softening into something less certain, and he did not speak right away, which in itself said more than any explanation could have. And across the table another executive reached for his own copy, flipping pages with slightly more urgency than before, the sound of paper breaking the silence that had held until now, and Ava watched none of them. She did not need to, because she recognized the pattern unfolding, the moment when certainty begins to fracture under the weight of overlooked detail, when authority is forced to confront something it had not accounted for. And still she remained still, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had already stepped beyond the need to prove anything further. And near the door the security officer shifted his stance again, no longer guarding, no longer guiding, simply present, uncertain of his role in a situation that had quietly moved beyond him. And Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, not in relaxation but in reassessment, his gaze lifting from the document for the first time since the pause began, moving not to the executives, not to the door, but to Ava, and in that moment the distance between them was measured not in feet, but in recognition, the first acknowledgement that she was no longer invisible, and though no apology was spoken, no explanation offered, the room had already begun to rearrange itself around a truth it could no longer ignore. No one spoke for a moment, not because they had nothing to say, but because whatever they had assumed was no longer certain, and uncertainty in a room like this did not announce itself loudly. It settled quietly, in shifting eyes, in hands that paused over documents. In the subtle way posture changed when confidence no longer had solid ground to stand on, and Richard Whitmore did not look away from Ava as long as he had before. His gaze steady now, not dismissive, not curious, something else. Entirely, something closer to evaluation, as if he were recalibrating a calculation he thought had already been solved. And when he finally broke the silence his voice was calm, measured, carrying across the table without effort. Who reviewed this section? He asked, not directing the question at Ava but at the room that had just minutes ago been so certain of its own precision, and the question did not land comfortably. It moved through the executives like a ripple, subtle but undeniable. Because it was not just about the document anymore. It was about accountability, and one of the senior legal advisors straightened slightly in his chair, adjusting his tie with a controlled motion that suggested composure, but his eyes flickered briefly toward the page. Before returning to the chairman, "Our team did, thoroughly," he replied, his tone professional, but lacking the firmness it had carried earlier, and Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he turned the page back once more, slower this time, his finger tracing the line again, not as if searching for confirmation, but as if ensuring there was no misinterpretation. And then he spoke again, quieter now, but sharper. "Then explain why this clause transfers liability entirely onto us in the event of a post-merger dispute." And the room did not freeze. It tightened, like something being pulled inward, because the implication was no longer theoretical. It was real, and the advisor hesitated, just long enough for the silence to stretch, just long enough for others to notice. And Ava remained still near the door, her presence now anchored in the moment, not as an interruption but as the origin of it. And she did not look at the chairman, did not seek acknowledgement. Her focus remained on the document, as if the truth did not belong to her voice but to the structure she had recognized. And across the table another executive leaned forward, scanning his own copy more urgently now, flipping back to the reference section, his lips pressing together as his eyes moved faster than before, and a faint crease formed on his forehead, mirroring the realization that had already begun to settle in others. And the legal advisor cleared his throat, this time less controlled. "It appears the language may have been layered," he said carefully, choosing each word with precision, but the hesitation behind them was clear, and Richard's expression did not change, but his posture shifted slightly, leaning back just enough to create distance between himself and the document, as if reassessing not only the page but the people who had assured him of its integrity and the authority in the room. Once concentrated and unquestioned, now felt distributed, unstable, and Ava could sense it. Without looking, the way the energy had shifted from dismissal to scrutiny, from certainty to doubt, and still she did not move, because she understood that her role in this moment was not to argue or defend. It was simply to have seen what others had not, and that alone had already changed everything. And near the doorway, the security officer stepped back another inch, no longer part of the equation at all, his presence fading into the background as the room reoriented itself around a new center of gravity. And Richard Whitmore's gaze returned briefly to Ava, not lingering, just enough to acknowledge her place in what was unfolding, before shifting back to the table where the weight of the decision he had nearly made now sat heavier than before, not because of its scale, but because of how close it had come to being overlooked. The explanation did not hold, not fully, and everyone in the room could feel it even before the words finished settling into the air, because layered was not a mistake, it was a design, and designs like that did not appear by accident in documents reviewed by experienced teams, and Richard Whitmore did not challenge the advisor directly. Not yet. Instead, he let the silence expand again. Just enough for the weight of that realization to press down on the room. Just enough for each person present to understand that this was no longer a routine meeting, and across the table one of the younger analysts shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between the claws and the chairman as if trying to reconcile what he had been told with what was now clearly written in front of him. And another executive reached for a glass of water, not out of thirst, but to fill the space where certainty had once been. And Ava stood exactly where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence now undeniable but still quiet, as if she had stepped into a current that was now moving on its own, carrying everything with it. And she did not feel triumphant, did not feel vindicated, she felt steady, the same steady she had felt when she first read the line. Because for her this was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about something not adding up, something that did not belong. And now the room was beginning to see it too, piece by piece, and Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, not impatient, not distracted, just marking the shift in tempo. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a sharper edge, not raised but more focused. Who drafted this language? He asked. And this time the question did not drift, it landed directly. And the legal advisor hesitated again, longer now, his earlier composure thinning under the pressure of clarity. It came from the opposing counsel during the final revision, he said, choosing his words carefully. And that answer did not resolve anything. It opened more, because it implied that something had been introduced late, something that had passed through review without being fully challenged. And Richard nodded once, slowly, as if confirming a suspicion rather than accepting an explanation, and he leaned forward slightly, bringing himself closer to the document again. But this time his attention was not just on the page. It was on the process that had allowed it to remain there, and the room followed his focus, not because they wanted to, but because they had to, because the center of authority had shifted from assumption to verification, and Ava could feel that shift even without looking directly at him. The way the energy of the room now aligned around scrutiny instead of dismissal, and near the doorway the security officer had fully stepped back, his hands now at his sides, no longer holding, no longer guiding, just observing, as if he too understood that whatever this moment had been when it began, it was no longer about removing someone who did not belong. It was about something far larger, something that had nearly gone unnoticed. And Richard's gaze moved once more, briefly, toward Ava, not lingering, not soft, but different, carrying a recognition that had not been there before, not of her role, not of her position, but of what she had done. And then he looked back at the table, at the document, at the people who had assured him it was sound, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was decisive, because the meeting had already changed direction, and there was no returning to what it had been just minutes earlier. The room did not erupt, it settled, and that was more unsettling than any sudden reaction could have been, because a quiet room like this meant people were thinking, recalculating, adjusting positions that had been fixed only minutes earlier, and Ava could feel the shift not through words but through stillness, the kind that pressed gently against the skin, the kind that made every small movement feel louder than it should, and she became aware of the faint scent of polished wood, the low hum of electricity in the walls, the distant echo of footsteps somewhere far down the hallway outside. All of it grounding her in a moment that no longer felt temporary, and yet she did not move, did not step forward, did not retreat. She remained exactly where she was, as if the space she occupied had finally become defined not by permission but by presence. And at the table, Richard Whitmore closed the folder halfway, not fully, just enough to signal that whatever came next would not follow the expected script, and his fingers rested on the edge of the document, no longer tapping, no longer searching, simply holding, and that stillness carried weight, because it meant the decision had paused, not out of confusion, but out of intention, and one of the executives shifted again, clearing his throat as if preparing to speak, then stopping, reconsidering, the words dissolving before they could form, and another leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling for a brief second before returning to the table, as if trying to step outside the moment, and failing. And Ava lowered her gaze slightly, not out of submission, but to the reflection of the room on the polished floor, where shapes moved differently, less defined, more honest, and she saw the outline of herself there, small compared to the table, smaller compared to the figures seated around it. And yet the reflection did not erase her. It held her, just as clearly as it held them, and that realization did not bring pride. It brought something quieter, something steadier, a sense that what had happened was not an interruption but a correction, and across the room Richard exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, the kind of breath that came not from pressure but from decision forming beneath the surface. And when he lifted his eyes again, they did not move immediately to the executives. They paused, just briefly, on Ava, not questioning, not doubting, simply acknowledging, and in that brief exchange something unspoken passed, not agreement, not gratitude, but recognition, the kind that does not need to be named to be understood. And then his gaze returned to the table, to the document, to the people who had built their certainty around it, and the silence stretched once more, not empty, not uncertain, but full, carrying the weight of what had nearly happened and what now would not. And no one reached for their phone, no one checked the time, because time itself seemed to have slowed, adjusted to the gravity of the moment, and Ava felt her breathing steady into that rhythm, matching the quiet, matching the pause, as if the room itself had taken a step back to reconsider everything it thought it knew. And for the first time since she had spoken, there was no pull toward the door, no expectation that she would leave, only the quiet understanding that the moment had not ended yet, and that whatever came next would not erase what had already changed. Richard Whitmore did not raise his voice when he finally spoke, but the effect was immediate, the kind of authority that did not need volume to command attention. "We are not signing this," he said, and the words did not echo. They settled, firm and irreversible, and for a moment no one moved, not because they were unsure of what he meant, but because they understood exactly what it meant, the deal, the timeline, the assumptions built around it. All of it had just been redirected by a single decision that could not be undone, and one of the executives opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, recognizing that this was not a discussion, it was a conclusion, and Richard did not look at him, did not invite debate. His gaze remained steady on the document as he slid it forward across the table, away from himself, as if creating distance between his name and what it almost became attached to. And the sound of paper against polished wood was quiet, but in that room it carried weight, and across the table the legal advisor lowered his eyes, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of something that had been missed, something that could no longer be explained away. And Ava felt the shift before she fully understood it, the subtle release of tension that had been building since the moment she spoke. Not relief, not yet, but a change in direction, a current that had turned, and she remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged, because she knew this moment did not belong to her. It belonged to the truth that had surfaced, and yet the room was no longer able to ignore where that truth had come from. And Richard leaned back slightly, his chair moving just a fraction of an inch, and for the first time since the interruption began, his attention moved fully away from the document and settled on Ava, not briefly this time, not in passing, but directly, and the distance between them felt different now, not erased, but redefined. And when he spoke again, his tone did not soften, but it shifted, carrying something more deliberate. "You said subsection C," he stated. Not asking, not questioning, just confirming. And Ava met his gaze without hesitation, her voice steady. "Yes, sir," she replied, and the simplicity of it did not diminish its weight, because it was not about how much she said. It was about the fact that she had seen what others had not, and Richard held that moment for a second longer than expected, as if measuring something beyond the immediate situation. Something about her presence, her certainty, her refusal to disappear when it would have been easier to do so. And then he nodded once, not as approval, not as praise, but as acknowledgement, and turned his attention back to the room. "We will review every clause again, line by line," he said, his voice returning to its earlier precision, but now carrying a sharper edge, and the executives responded not with words but with movement, papers shifting, pens lifting, posture straightening, because the direction had been set, and the meeting that had once been routine was now something else entirely. And near the doorway, the security officer stepped back fully, blending into the background, no longer needed, no longer relevant to what was unfolding, and Ava remained where she was, not asked to leave, not told to stay, simply present, her role in the moment complete, and yet still unfolding. Because what had changed in the room was not just the outcome of a decision, it was the recognition that the smallest voice, when grounded in truth, could alter the course of something far larger than itself. The movement in the room resumed, but it was no longer the same movement, no longer casual or automatic. It was intentional now, measured, as if every action carried more weight than before, and papers that had once been glanced over were now studied. Pens that had hovered idly were now used with precision, and the quiet confidence that had filled the space earlier had been replaced by something more grounded, something closer to caution. And Ava remained near the doorway, not stepping forward, not drawing attention, but no longer fading into the background either, because even without speaking again, her presence had already altered the rhythm of the room. And Richard Whitmore watched the table for a moment longer before shifting his attention once more, not to the document this time, but to Ava. And there was no hesitation in the way he addressed her, no uncertainty in the decision behind it. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice steady, carrying across the room without effort. And the question itself caused a subtle pause, because it acknowledged something that had not been acknowledged before, and Ava answered without delay. "Ava Johnson, sir," her tone calm, neither overly formal nor casual, just clear, and Richard nodded once, as if placing that name into a space that had previously been empty, and for a brief second the room seemed to adjust again, because a name carried weight. It transformed someone from a role into a person, and that shift was not lost on anyone present, and Richard rested his hand lightly on the table, his fingers no longer tense, no longer tapping, simply still, and when he spoke again there was a slight change in his tone, not softer, but more deliberate. "You saw something that an entire team missed," he said, not as a compliment, not as a statement meant to elevate, but as a fact, and Ava did not react outwardly, did not nod, did not smile, because for her it had not been about being right. It had been about something not aligning, something that demanded attention, and she simply answered, "I read it carefully." And the simplicity of her response carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it pointed to something fundamental, something that had been overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it had not been given the attention it required. And across the table one of the executives shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence replaced by quiet reflection, and another avoided eye contact altogether, focusing instead on the document as if trying to recover something that had already been lost. And Richard held Ava's gaze for a moment longer, not evaluating now, not measuring, but acknowledging, and then he leaned back slightly, his posture no longer rigid, but composed, as if the tension that had built had settled into clarity. And when he spoke again his voice carried a different kind of authority, not just control, but direction. "Stay," he said, the words simple, unadorned, but unmistakable, and it was not a command issued to remove. It was an invitation to remain, to be part of what followed, and Ava did not move immediately, not out of hesitation, but because the moment itself required a second to settle, to be understood, and when she finally gave a slight nod, it was not submission, it was acceptance of a space that had not been offered to her before, and the room adjusted once more, not dramatically, but enough, because the presence that had once been dismissed had now been recognized, not through apology, not through correction, but through action, and as the meeting continued, the balance had shifted permanently, not in words, but in the quiet, undeniable way that respect begins to form when truth cannot be ignored. The meeting did not end with applause or acknowledgement. It dissolved gradually, like something that had reached its natural conclusion without needing to be announced, and one by one the executives gathered their papers, their movements quieter than before, more deliberate, as if each action carried a trace of what had just happened, and no one rushed to speak. No one attempted to reclaim the confidence that had filled the room earlier, because it no longer fit the moment, and Ava Johnson remained near the doorway for a few seconds longer, not out of uncertainty, but because the stillness had not yet fully released her, the weight of the room lingering in the air like a memory that had not yet settled, and when she finally turned, her steps were steady, unhurried, the soft sound of her shoes against the marble floor blending into the quiet that now defined the space, and behind her the long table remained, the document still open, but no longer untouched, no longer unquestioned, and Richard Whitmore stood as the last of the others exited, his gaze resting briefly on the place where Ava had stood, not searching, not analyzing, simply remembering, and there was no need to call her back, no need to add words to what had already been understood, because the shift had already taken place, not in a single decision, but in the recognition that had followed it. And as Ava stepped into the hallway, the light changed, softer, less reflective, the glass and steel replaced by something quieter, more ordinary, and yet her reflection still followed her in the polished surfaces along the corridor, not distorted, not diminished, just present, and she did not look back immediately, because she did not need to. The room behind her had already changed, and whatever remained there no longer required her voice. And a few feet ahead the cleaning cart waited where she had left it, a simple frame of metal and supplies that had defined her role before she entered the room, and for a moment she paused beside it, her hand resting lightly on the handle, feeling the familiar texture beneath her fingers, grounding, steady, and nothing about it had changed, the bottles, the cloth, the quiet expectation of work that continued whether anyone noticed or not. And yet something had shifted, not in the cart, not in the hallway, but in the space she carried with her, the understanding that being unseen did not mean being without value, and that truth did not require permission to exist, and far behind her, through layers of glass and distance, the boardroom lights dimmed slightly as the meeting formally concluded, but the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, holding the echo of a moment where something small had altered something large, and Ava adjusted her grip on the handle, her posture unchanged, her expression calm,